Welcome, everyone. This is another in the sort of ad hoc series of seminars from the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics here in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine. I think most people here are in the school. There are a few people. That's great. Our speaker today, we are incredibly fortunate to have. Dr. Jonathan Chevrier is from McGill University in Canada, and he's Canadian originally. Jonathan is an environmental epidemiologist. Is that okay?
That's great.
Yeah. Has a so he's like the best of both worlds. He works in environmental health, but he has a PhD in epidemiology. He trained at I don't know, where did you do your undergraduate?
Undergraduate at Laval University.
At Laval University in Quebec, yeah.
And then a PhD at Berkeley.
And then a PhD at University of California, Berkeley, which is one of the centers in the United States of epidemiological methods and methodological research. And Jonathan will be speaking to us today on the control of confounding and advanced methods in the control of confounding. And for some of you, you'll be familiar with this. For others of you, you will be familiar with this.
Hopefully.
At some stage in the future in your life, because it's good for you. And so we're looking forward to have Jonathan talk. He's a gifted teacher and a really knowledgeable fellow along the way. And Jonathan, we usually go for about, anywhere between 45 and 55 minutes.
Okay.
You're probably very interactive, but to allow a little bit of time for questions and things at the end.
Yep, that sounds good.
Cool. And your next meeting after this is at? Perfect.
Tons
of time.
I've got lots of time.
So you can have
I'm keep you guys here for a long time.
Cool. Jonathan, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So first, I want to thank number one, Jeb Wu, who's been inviting me and have been inviting me for probably like 2 years to come and give talks, and so I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for also Magnan for being so gracious since I've been here. So today I'm going to be talking to you about determining cause and effect in observational studies. And here's my plan for today. By the way, okay, a few things I want to say before I get started, which is that I like these presentations when they are interactive. And so I want you to ask any questions that you want. If there's something that's not clear, please let me know. I don't want to be just talking to myself and then losing everybody. So if you've got any questions, please let me know. Every question is valid. I always tell students in my class, there's no stupid question. If you've got a question, there's a really high probability that someone else who has the same question, so please ask it. This is a non-judgmental area. So any questions is good. If it happens that we end up just going and veering in different directions, and I don't have time to finish absolutely everything that I wanted to talk about, that's fine. I usually plan for too much stuff to talk about anyway. Okay, so today I'm going to be starting with more basic stuff that I would expect everybody knows, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then slowly things are going to get a little bit more involved. I'm going to be talking about some things I assume that you know, association versus causation, and the fact that they're not the same thing. About bias, different classes of bias, confounding, selection bias, and information bias. I'm going to tell you about using directed acyclic graphs, or DAGs, to assess bias, but also to correct for bias. We're going to be talking a little bit about Hill's criteria in the context of trying to establish causality. We're going to be talking about what would be the perfect study. And that will be in the context of what's called potential outcome or counterfactual framework. Some people also call that causal methods. I don't think there are any more causal than other methods, but they are certainly potential outcome or counterfactual framework type of studies. We're going to be talking about weight of evidence to try and establish causality. A little bit about the precautionary principle, because I work in environmental epidemiology, as Lyndon said. So that's the reason for a little first here. And this is something that's very dear to our heart, and hopefully you'll agree with me. Okay, so let's talk about association versus causation. These are graphs that I really like to show students about all sorts of correlations that one can find. These are real data. I didn't make that up. And so you can see here that per capita cheese consumption correlates very strongly with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Divorce rate in Maine correlates with per capita consumption of margarine. Perfect correlation. True data. Per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese correlates with civil engineering doctorates awarded. And so you might see that in some studies, people will just use correlations like that between variable A and variable B, and then try to understand what it is that that one might mean, right? And so someone might say, well, there's a picture that emerges here. Maybe margarine breaks up families. That's why it's associated with divorce. Maybe generous conflicts. What's the potential mechanism of action? Maybe there's an impact on brain function. On the other hand, it looks like cheese makes you smarter. Maybe there's an impact on cognition and memory. And so some people will then come up with new hypotheses to test. Maybe fat negatively affects behavior but positively affects intelligence. Maybe there's different components in cheese and margarine that impact the brain. Now I'm giving you that as a silly example, but as something that you may see, that I certainly see in the literature, well, people will first look at all sorts of different correlations and then try to draw conclusions and hypotheses based on it. That's dangerous. Oh, a few more. Age of Miss America correlates with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. I've got one last one. Letters in the winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee correlates with the number of people killed by banana spiders. These are real data. All right. So of course, association, I'm assuming that everybody knows that here. Association is not causation. This is another example, a graph that I like. So this boy who says, I used to think correlation implied causation, and I took a statistics class, now I don't. Sounds like the class helped. Well, maybe. There's an association here. Who knows if there was a causation? And one thing that I want you to keep in mind, so I'm giving you these silly examples, but that's really caricaturing things that happen in reality. And this is something that's called the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now the silly example is this one that's well known. If pigs have wings, then some winged animals are good to eat. Some winged animals are good to eat, therefore pigs have wings. And you'll see these fallacies being done day in and day out in science. And here's an example that's less silly. If sewer service causes heart disease, then heart disease should be more prevalent where sewer service is present. Makes sense. Heart disease is more prevalent where sewer service is present. Therefore, sewer service causes heart disease. Does that make sense? It's logically, right? It's internally, the internal logic is correct. But you know that doesn't make sense, right? And so these types of inductivism, where essentially you use the data to generate hypotheses, rather than starting with an a priori hypothesis and testing it. There's a really big difference in terms of the validity when you try to do causal inference. Here's another potential threat to validity. Silly example again, but that happens all the time in studies. So these penguins saying, do you think all these film crews brought on global warming? Or did global warming bring on all these film crews? In epidemiology, what do you call that? Anybody knows? When you essentially mix up causes and effect. No? Reverse.
You're going to embarrass us.
Really? At least one person. I said that wanted that to be interactive.
Call on somebody. Everyone averts their eye.
That's usually what happens. You look at someone and then they go like that. Nobody knows that? Really?
No, they don't.
What is your question again?
So, what is that concept? Thanks for asking.
Sorry.
What is that concept when we tend to mix up cause and effect? This is this silly example, right? So, say someone goes and then take measurements. And then realizes that as temperature rises, there's more and more film crews in the Arctic. Is it the rising temperature that's bringing up the film crews? Or is it because the film crews are coming that the temperature is going up? So you're mixing cause and effect. Yeah, reverse causation, right? That's a really important threat to validity, right? Particularly in cross-sectional studies. How about this one? Excellent health statistics. Smokers are less likely to die of age-related illnesses. Great news. Anybody knows what you call that? I'll give you another example. I'm doing a study of air pollution. I do environmental health. I'm doing a study of air pollution and heart disease. But a number of people died of lung cancer before getting heart disease. Or they got into traffic accident. Survival bias. It could lead to survival bias. Usually we call that competing risk. Okay, some lessons, and those are serious. Association is not causation. Statistics are powerless to differentiate cause from effect. It's not because one variable is associated with another variable that you necessarily know which caused which. Only design can help you answer that question. Remember the dangers of inductivism. You want to have an a priori hypothesis and then test it. There's a lot of potential danger to just generating a result and then trying to come up with a hypothesis explaining it. And you'll see that a lot in the literature. That's my point. Essentially, the point that I want to make here is that subject matter, and that's something I'm going to come back to on a regular basis, is that subject matter knowledge is essential for valid causal inference. Statistics are not enough for you to be able to do that. And so to ensure causality, one needs to eliminate bias, and so there's three different general categories of bias: confounding bias, selection bias, and information bias. Today I'm going to be talking primarily about confounding, a little bit about selection. I'm going to leave off information bias for now. Okay, all right. So now we're approaching the use of DAGs. I want to start by just telling you about that conventional rule of confounding, possibly the one that you've read here and there. And so the conventional rules of confounding usually go this way. Confounder is a variable that is associated with the outcome, or risk factor for the outcome, associated with exposure, not on the causal pathway between exposure and outcome, and the end result is the distortion of the exposure-outcome relation. Does that sound familiar? Okay, great. Now I'm going to give you a few examples where these rules apply. I'm going to be talking about DAGs for a little while, and then you can tell me after I've talked about DAGs whether or not you think that you should control from these variables. Number of birds flying above Table Mountain on December 12, 2016 is associated with the outcome and exposure in your data. Do you control for it? It's associated with the exposure, associated with the outcome. It's not on a causal path. Age is a risk factor for heart disease, but it's not a determinant of exposure. Same thing again. It follows these rules. Do you adjust for age? In a study of air pollution and heart disease, air pollution causes high blood pressure, but those with high blood pressure take action to reduce future exposure. Do you control for blood pressure? So think about what you think are the answers to these questions now. And let's see after we've talked about DAGs if you think the same way. Okay, let's talk about DAGs. So what are they? So G stands for graph. They are essentially diagrams that represent an assumed system of causal connection between variables. They are directed because arrows represent a causal connection between variables. So you will go into assume, based on subject matter knowledge, what variable causes what. And we call them acyclic because cycles are not permitted, because a variable cannot cause itself. So you can never follow arrows and then come back to a certain variable, right? Otherwise, that would mean that you think that you can go back in time. We're not able to do that yet, okay? Before I go farther, I should have asked that before I started talking and describing these DAGs. How many people, if you, by show of hand, how many people here know what a DAG is, or knew before I showed you that? How many people uses them in their research? Fewer. How many people is confident that they understand that well? Nobody. All right, okay. So I'm not going to waste my time. Hopefully you'll have a better idea. So, first let me tell you why I think that DAGs are very helpful. Number one, they help you make your assumptions explicit. Some people, when they draw DAGs, they will tell me, well, it's too complicated, I don't know, so I'd rather not do it. That's fine. However, when you run your analysis, you need to remember that there's a number of assumptions that you're making about your data. Drawing your DAG forces you to make these assumptions. And if it's hard to do your DAG, it's because you don't know a number of things. And it's good for you to know what you know and know what you don't know. That allows you also, if you're not exactly sure what is the connection between the variables, that allows you to do something that's called sensitivity analysis. So essentially running your data, making different assumptions. And if you find that the assumptions that you make doesn't change your result, then you know you're safe. You know, that doesn't matter so much. If your results are very different depending on the assumptions that you make, then you need to find out a little bit more. And maybe you need to put less confidence in your result. So number one, it helps you make your assumptions explicit. Helps you identify potential biases. It helps you determine how to correct for these biases. And helps you also avoid introducing biases in your analysis stage. So sometimes you may control for a variable and add bias rather than remove bias. Using these DAGs are going to help you identify that. Okay, so key definition. This is an example of a really simple DAG. And whenever you see the letter A, I'm going to be talking about your exposure of interest. Whenever you see the letter Y, the outcome of interest. Whenever you see the letter L, I'm going to be talking about a covariate. If you see me put a rectangle or a square around a variable, that means that I've adjusted for it. So either I've included a variable, say in the linear model. I might use other terms saying things like I have stratified or conditioned on the variable. All these terms mean exactly the same thing. If you read the literature, you're going to see that. People will alternatively use the same term, but essentially it means I've adjusted for that variable. If you see a variable with two arrows pointing to it, I'm going to call this variable a collider. Okay? Whenever I use the variable C, I'm going to be talking about censoring. Censoring would be, for instance, loss to follow. Are we clear so far? Any questions about this? This is you have to understand that if you want to understand the rest of the talk. Yeah?
No, it's all good.
I had a question.
Here C is a censoring variable and it's also a collider.
That's right.
Are all colliders censoring variables?
No. No. Mm-hmm. Number of different variables could be colliders. And not all colliders are censoring variables and not all censoring variables are colliders. Okay. So, basic DAG theory tells you this. In order to identify causal effect, all indirect, sometimes they're called backdoor paths, leading from exposure to outcome need to be blocked. All non-causal paths. And I'm going to give you some example. Oh, number one, I need to explain to you how do you block a path. A path, there's several ways to block a path. It will be blocked if it contains a non-collider that is conditioned on. So in this particular case, without conditioning, I had a backdoor path that was open. That means that in this particular situation, if I had not conditioned on L, I would have bias. This would be confounding bias. If I control for it, I block the path. I'm only left with the causal path.
And so when you say if you condition on, do you use stratifying?
Right, so condition on, stratify, or adjust for, or include in your regression model. Yeah, it's all the same thing, yes. Then you've got, a path is blocked also when it contains a collider. So this path here is blocked. However, oops, conditioning on a collider or conditioning on a descendant of a collider is going to open a path. All right, so you need to remember these rules. If you've got a non-collider that's conditioned on, you've blocked a path. If you've got a collider, you've blocked a path. If you condition on a collider, you open the path. If you don't condition on a non-collider, you've got an open path. Are we good? Yes.
Also good on the collider. Could you just clarify that? What a collider is?
What a collider is? So let me give you an example. Say, and I use in this case, say that people who have higher level of exposure and who are more likely to experience your outcome are more likely to drop out of the study. In this particular case, dropping out of the study is causally related to your exposure and your outcome. So that would be an example of a collider. Other questions? Okay, you need to understand that because you're going to have to do exercises soon. You're ready. Okay, so based on these rules, there's 3 different types of statistical association that could happen. And there's a bias that's associated with each of these 3 different types of statistical association. You could have a cause and effect. Exposure actually causes the outcome. The bias, the potential bias that's associated with that is reverse causality, right? You may, in fact, think that the exposure causes the outcome, but it turns out that it goes the other way around. By the way, what do you think is the sine qua non situation? What is the, in what situation would you be absolutely sure that you don't have reverse causality? Different timelines, right? If the exposure happens before the outcome, then there's no way that the outcome caused the exposure, right? So these types of things really can be resolved with your study design. Common causes is another way that you could have an association between an exposure and an outcome. And the bias that's associated with that is, I'm sure you know that. What would it be? Confounding, right? Okay. The other one would be conditioned common effect, where I told you that if you condition, or if you adjust for, or if you stratify, all the same thing, or a collider, you're opening a path. And this one is a little bit less known, but this will generate a form of selection bias. And a little bit later, I'm going to be talking about it a little bit more, and hopefully it will become more obvious how is it that conditioning on a collider induces selection bias. Okay, but first let's talk about confounding. Okay. Let me give you just a few examples. This is an example of confounding. You can have 2 types of confounding, one that I call structural. So my example here is, say that I've got an exposure, let me see, this is, say that I've got an exposure and I want to know, is this exposure causing change in IQ? Does it affect brain development? But I know that socioeconomic status is causing a change in exposure and also IQ. So an example is lead, right? So lead in this particular case is, we know, has an impact on IQ. But socioeconomic status, people with lower socioeconomic status tend to have higher lead levels, right? So it could be that part of the association that you see between lead exposure and IQ, or maybe all of it, could be caused really by socioeconomic status. Another type of confounding will be what I call empirical. In that particular case, the variable doesn't necessarily cause the exposure, but they're associated. People who have high lead exposure tend, for another reason, to have also high exposure to pesticides. Both of these variables could cause changes in IQ. In an association between, or in a study of pesticides and IQ, lead is also a potential confounder. All right? So a variable could be a confounder, either if it's structural, there's actually a causal connection here, or whether there's actually an association between those two variables. However, a causal connection here is required. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you to try 3 different things. I'm going to give you examples, and maybe in teams of 2, I'm going to ask you just to take a few minutes and try and draw what DAG you would draw for that research question. Here's my research question. My exposure of interest is prenatal lead levels. The outcome of interest is IQ. My covariate socioeconomic status. But I've got another variable, which is grade point average, the grades that the student gets in schools. My questions are this. What would your DAG look like? And would you control for GPA? So I'm giving you 2 minutes to try to draw your DAGs and teams.
That's great. You're in an interactive session, go to the front. This is great.
Yeah? Okay. Good. Good. Especially for this, just hearing it is not enough. You need to be able to figure things out. Yes. Quite a bit of series learn about it. It's hard. That can make sure that all the students
Did they ever come up with something like totally random that you bet the top that you make
yeah, the topics. I also want to make, especially like I said, topic that I don't know. And first year, it is. And then we have situations where.
Yeah, but that's the risk, right?
That's the risk.
Yeah. But if you're able to approve that the topics, then we interviewed a person on.
Yes. Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
That's right. That was just connection to something. Yeah. Interview.
All right, okay. We're going to come back because we've got 2 more, and I want to make sure you have time to do them, and I have time to tell you at least some of what I want to tell you. Okay, so you may have found that one, it's not so easy to do. The other thing I want to tell you, I'm going to show you now my DAG. You may not agree with me, and that's okay. Okay? Because different people might have different information. Essentially what you're trying to encode in your DAG is information that you know about the relationship between these variables. And that means that if your DAG is different than mine, you may run your analysis differently than mine. Which means that in a paper you'd have to explain to people what was your rationale. Why is it that you decided to run the analysis this way or this other way? Okay, so this is what my DAG looks like. And so I'm interested in whether lead causes changes in IQ. Socioeconomic status, I told you before, was causally related to lead. We know also that socioeconomic status is related to scores, not necessarily to intelligence, but to scores on IQ tests. In the same way, socioeconomic status tends to be associated with grades. And so in this particular case, if you agree with, and IQ is also causally associated with grades. And so in this particular case, if I control for GPA, what happens? Did I remove bias or did I introduce bias? I introduced bias, right? Because now there's a backdoor path going from exposure to outcome that's not causal. Okay. Once again, if you remember the standard criteria for confounding that I gave you before, the variable had to be associated with the exposure. This variable will be associated with the exposure. The variable had to be associated with the outcome. The variable had to not be on the causal path. This variable is associated with the exposure, associated with the outcome, not on the causal path. Yet, if you control for it, you're going to introduce bias based on my data. Okay, another one, and we're going to do it a little bit faster. My exposure is called BPA, bisphenol A. That's a chemical that, by the way, in the US and Canada, about 95% of the population has detectable levels of. So almost everybody's exposed. I would expect that it's probably true also in South Africa. And I want to know whether BPA causes change in IQ again. What you need to know is that BPA is an estrogenic chemical, and so there's reason to believe that there may be a causal connection between BPA and BMI. All right, so in this particular case, similar questions. What would your DAG look like? Would you control for BMI? And what would be the consequence of controlling for BMI if you did?
So is the theory that BPA would lead to high BMI or the other way around?
That BPA would lead to high BMI. Yeah.
Exposure to low associated non-circumstantial increases or exposure to BPA?
Possibly. Possibly. Now, of course, that means that depending on the information you have, your DAG might look different. But yes, I can tell you that in the literature so far, it looks like there is a causal connection between SES and BMI. Of course, if you didn't know that, your DAG would be different.
What was the next one?
So this can obey an IQ or the outcome again. Consequent status. The EPA has an excellent
What has never been totally
Yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah.
The only example that like really the substantial effect size is essentially with even that.
So yeah, the question is always also, is the bias large enough? Yeah. Remember, there's also controlling for first. Gestational age. The one that's the obvious is reflection. So the exposed and the outcome exposed could make
We do not confounder selection.
no.
The issue, but rather it explains bias.
Okay. All right, so here's what my, now that you've thought about it, I'm going to show you my DAG, once again, depending on knowledge. Right, I've told you before that all established causality is based on the knowledge that you have about the interaction between these variables. Here's what I came up based on the knowledge that I have about these variables. I'm finding this. EPA causally related to BMI. I'm answering the question whether EPA affects IQ. But socioeconomic status, we know is related to obesity. Socioeconomic status is related to measures, not necessarily IQ again, but measures of IQ. Someone else might have also put an arrow here. But it's not really going to change my answer, which is in this particular case, controlling for BMI is opening a path between exposure and outcome that's not causal. Did most people get that? And once again, you could have an arrow here, but it's not really going to change my answer here. Okay, I had a third one, but I'm going much slower than I was planning, so I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so now I gave you two examples. I would have given you a third one if we had had time, where once again, the standard rules of confounding apply, but I've shown you that you should not apply for these variables. So which one should you do? Do you guys use modern epidemiology to teach
No, advanced course.
in advanced courses? So this is considered by many the sort of Bible of epidemiology. That's what we use heavily to teach epidemiology. Rothman and Greenlands are very big names in epidemiological methods, and this is what they say. So if you don't believe me, maybe you believe them. There are cases in which the conventional and DAG-based criteria disagree, and when they diverge, it is the conventional criteria that fail. So what I'm telling you here is that maybe using these criteria is not the right way. So let's now think about what criteria should we be using. Based on what we've talked about, maybe a confounding variable is one that causes the outcome, is associated with the exposure, is not a descendant of the exposure or the outcome. I gave you that example when you had GPA, which was a descendant or an effect of the an effect of the outcome. Is not a collider. However, it so happens that a variable can be both a collider and a confounder. So what do? What I'm telling you here is that if you're asking yourself this question, you're asking yourself the wrong question. It's not about criteria anymore. Confounding will be controlled whenever all backdoor paths are blocked in the DAG. That's what you need to keep in mind. And so trying to come up with criteria that will fit every single situation is virtually impossible. You need to sit down and draw your DAG and try to encode in that DAG information about what you know about the relationship between the variables. Okay. You remember I told you about these different situations. I'm not going to ask you to actually use a DAG, but in this situation, number of birds flying above Table Mountain on a certain date is associated with the outcome and the exposure in your data. Would you control for that variable? That should be a clear answer. You should have really that clearly in your mind.
It depends.
Right? It depends.
Yeah, by conventional method, I would have
Yes.
adjusted.
But now that you know what I taught you.
Variable and that.
No, right? This is a random variable that has nothing to do with your analysis, right? In your DAG, it would just be the variable there with no arrow going anywhere. But you will see people doing that. You will see people in papers just adjusting a variable for a variable because it happens to be associated with the exposure and the outcome. This is a more difficult one. Age is a risk factor for heart disease, but not a determinant of exposure. If you think about the DAG, that means that age would be going with an arrow to heart disease, but no association between age and the exposure. Do you control for age? Based on what I've told you? No, you wouldn't. So, however, a lot of people do. What do you think is the consequence generally of X? Because in this very particular situation, you would probably have a really hard time publishing a paper without adjusting for age. Even though you told people, no, I'm not finding, say for cancer, right? Say that you're doing a study on cancer. Age is causally related to cancer, but you say, no, there's no relationship with exposure. Look at my DAG. There's a number of people that will still be uncomfortable with you not doing it. And so there are situations where practically, sometimes you may have to adjust for a variable, knowing that it's not going to make a difference.
The fire alarm goes off periodically.
Okay.
You're perfectly safe.
Okay, good. By the way, what is generally the consequence of it adjusting for a variable that's not a confounder? Say that that's true. There's no relationship with the exposure. What's going to happen? Change the effect size? What are the other? Essentially, if there's no relationship between your variable and your exposure, including the variable, your estimate will stay exactly the same. It's not a confounder. So including the variable will not change your estimate, but in general, adding more variable to a model increases the variance. So you're going to reduce your statistical power with no impact on correcting for bias.
Please note that only when it is, do not evacuate the building. Please note that only it is. Thank you.
I'm going to, do I talk about this? Very briefly, because I'm about to run out of time and there's still a few things I want to talk about. You know what? No, I'm changing my mind. If you want to talk about time-varying confounding affected by prior exposure, we could talk about it. I'm just going to skip that. Because I want to talk to you a little bit about selection bias. So we've talked about how to identify confounding, how to control for confounding, how to not control for some variables, and yes, control for other variables, and how controlling for some variables sometimes can introduce bias. Now I want to talk about selection bias just for a few minutes. Selection bias, there's several different mechanisms through which selection bias can occur. One of those mechanisms is a situation where you are controlling for a collider. So say that you're in a situation where the exposure determines whether or not someone is lost to follow-up. The outcome determines whether or not someone is lost to follow-up. Controlling, essentially, in this particular case, because I'm essentially stratifying, right? If I'm conducting my analysis only in a portion of my data, right? Some of the people are just not there anymore. It's the equivalent of stratifying, right? I'm only conducting my analysis on the people who are not lost to follow-up, right? So I'm essentially conducting my analysis on the strata of my data. So I'm essentially conditioning or stratifying by doing that and introducing a relationship. Okay, and you could have another situation where the exposure just happens to be associated with whether or not people are lost to follow-up. Okay. I'm going to try to explain to you how is it that stratifying on a collider induces an association. That was always a little bit odd to me, and hopefully this example is going to help you understand how that happens. I'm going to talk to you again about exposure to BPA and IQ. So say that if children with low BPA exposure, say children who are in a family where people are more health conscious, BPA comes from plastics, and so people know about that, and they are less likely to use plastics. And so therefore, people with low BPA exposure are more likely to remain in a study. And people whose children have lower IQ, say concerned parents, are more likely to remain in the study. Okay, so essentially the health conscious people, more likely to stay in the study. The people whose children have lower IQ, they're concerned, more likely to stay in the study than the other people. Now, among your participants, a child with higher BPA exposure will be more likely to have a low IQ. Would you agree with that? So I'm telling you that people with low BPA and low IQ are more likely to remain in your study. If a child does not have low BPA, has low IQ, has high BPA, then he's more likely to have the other condition that makes this child more likely to stay in the study. Does that make any sense? So what I'm saying here is that I've introduced a relationship between high BPA exposure and low IQ in my participants, even though there was no relationship in the general population. So hopefully that helps you understand how is it that stratify can actually induce a relationship. Okay, so how do you control for selection bias? You can't just control for it by including a variable in the model. One way to do it is to use a method that's called inverse probability weighting.
Please note, the probability system will now be tested. Please ignore all signals and alarms. And to repeat, please ignore all signals and alarms. This is only a test. Do not evacuate the building. Thank you.
Okay. So assume that there are two main variables, or 1, 2, 3 main variables that will determine whether or not a person remains in a study. Their exposure level, their socioeconomic status level, and their age. What I'm showing to you here, C equals 1 means that the person was censored. C equals 0, the person was not censored. Now what I can see is that, say, for this person here, that people who had low SES were aged more than 25 years of age. These people, and low exposure. So low exposure, low SES, more than 25 years of age. I had 4 of these people, and I lost 1 to follow-up. What I could do essentially is reweigh the people who are remaining to try and go back to the original sample had I not lost anybody to follow-up. Another way to do that is I'm going to take the inverse probability. So in this particular case, I've got 1 over 3. That means I'm going to give these people, 1 over 4. So 1 person over 4 remain in the sample. I'll ask 3 people to participate. So I'm going to give this 1 person a weight of 4 to go back to the original sample that I had. Does that make sense? It's a little bit trickier to explain, right? And so this means that if I've got information about all the determinants of loss to follow-up, I can reconstruct that original sample before losing people to follow-up. Now you can have a difficulty in a situation like this. What if I've got a 0 here? What's the inverse of 0? It's undefined. So this is an important assumption that we're making. That's called a positivity assumption. Essentially that there's a more than 0 probability of remaining in the sample. I'm going to skip this just to tell you that these types of adjustments can be done to adjust for a number of selection bias type errors. So number one, I talked to you, if you go from your analysis sample to original study sample to adjust for loss to follow-up. Whoops. What happened there?
Attention please. Attention please. We are investigating an alarm condition. Please listen for further announcements.
All right.
Sorry, John.
Attention please. Attention please. This is an emergency. Please leave the building by the nearest available exit. Do not use the lift.
Okay.
Maybe just carry on, John.
Yeah. All right. I'm actually just about to end. I'm going to end on this. So what I wanted to tell you here is that these types of methods can adjust for different types of selection bias, whether it's loss to follow-up, essentially going from the sample that you're doing your analysis on, from the sample that you started with, or when you're trying to do inference, so essentially apply the results in your study sample to your target population. So I think this person wants me to end. Yeah. So since it's the time, I'm just going to end here. And maybe if we can close the door. Yes. All right. So I think I'm going to end here, and please let me know if you've got any questions.
Okay. So that was a Herculean effort. Fire alarms, crowded rooms, class exercises. Please let's give Jonathan a wonderful hand. Jonathan, this is incredibly complex material, and you do a fabulous job of explaining with energy and clarity and examples. I'm about to spring on you the idea of bringing you back to teach more, so just say yes.